It was a chilly evening, and James wiped the grease off his hands, looking at the reflection of the setting sun on the hood of a luxury car he had just finished working on. The smell of oil and metal clung to him, but he didn't mind. It was honest work, the kind that made his hands rough and his pockets just full enough to get by. Today, though, was special. His little sister, Lily, had just graduated college, the first in their family to do so, and he had promised her a dinner at one of the finest restaurants in town. He didn't belong to the world of chandeliers, polished silverware, and whispered conversations, but tonight wasn't about him. It was about celebrating Lily's achievement, a moment that had been years in the making. He parked his modest truck outside the grand entrance of the restaurant, its golden lights glowing against the glass facade. He stepped out, straightening his jacket, a little too worn, but the best he had. Lily was already waiting at the entrance, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "James, you actually dressed up," she teased, nudging him playfully. He chuckled, holding the door open for her as they stepped inside. The moment they entered, the warmth of the restaurant wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the cool evening outside. The soft hum of classical music played in the background. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved like dancers, and the air carried the aroma of expensive spices and aged wine. James approached the podium where a tall, lean man in a black suit stood, holding a leather-bound reservation book. "Good evening," James said. "I have a reservation under James Carter." The maitre d' barely looked up, his eyes flickering to James's attire. He had seen the type before, men who had no place in an establishment like this. "One moment," he said, his fingers tapping the pages in mock concentration. After a brief pause, he gave a dismissive smile. "I'm sorry, sir. There's no reservation under that name." James frowned, pulling out his phone to show the confirmation email. "There must be a mistake. I booked this 2 weeks ago." The maitre d' barely glanced at the screen before shaking his head. "I'm afraid we are fully booked for the evening." James's jaw tightened. "So what do you suggest?" "We leave." Lily, sensing the tension, gently placed a hand on his arm. "James, it's okay. Maybe we can go somewhere else." But James wasn't one to back down so easily. "No, we have a reservation. We'll wait for a table if we have to." The maitre d' sighed, exchanging a look with a nearby waiter, before turning back with a smirk. "Sir, I don't think this is the kind of place you're looking for. Perhaps a more casual establishment would be better suited for you." James's blood ran cold. He wasn't an idiot. He knew exactly what was happening. His calloused hands, his oil-stained fingernails, his work boots that had seen better days. They had already judged him before he had even spoken. But he wasn't going to make a scene. He took a deep breath, nodded, and turned to leave. Lily followed, her expression a mix of disappointment and anger. "James, that wasn't fair," she said as they stepped outside. He shrugged, forcing a smile. "Doesn't matter. Let's just find another place." But before they could take another step, a voice stopped them. "Is there a problem here?" James turned to see an older man in an expensive suit standing just inside the entrance. His presence alone commanded attention, the kind of man who wasn't used to hearing the word no. The maitre d' straightened instantly. "No problem at all, Mr. Harrington," he said smoothly. "Just a small misunderstanding." Harrington's sharp eyes flicked between James and the maitre d'. "What kind of misunderstanding?" The maitre d' hesitated, choosing his words carefully. This gentleman did not have a proper reservation, and given the exclusivity of our restaurant, we have to be selective. Harrington raised an eyebrow before turning his full attention to James. "What's your name, son?" "James Carter." Harrington's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze deepened. "James Carter, the mechanic?" James was taken aback. Yeah, that's me." A slow smirk spread across Harrington's face, and then, to everyone's shock, he turned to the maitre d' with an expression so cold it could freeze fire. "You just turned away the man who has been servicing my cars for the past 10 years? The maitre d' visibly paled. I didn't know, sir." Harrington didn't even acknowledge the excuse. Instead, he turned back to James. "Come inside, both of you. You're dining with me tonight." James hesitated, but Lily grinned and grabbed his arm. "James, come on. As they stepped back inside, the entire atmosphere shifted. Waiters scrambled to set a table. The maitre d' suddenly all smiles, pulling out chairs and apologizing profusely. James said nothing, simply watching as the people who had dismissed him minutes ago were now bending over backward. The meal was exquisite, the kind of food he had never even imagined tasting, and Harrington, true to his nature, made sure James and Lily were treated like royalty. As the evening wound down, Harrington leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. "You know, James, you remind me of myself when I was young. People judge too quickly, thinking they know your worth just by looking at you." He took a sip of his wine, his gaze sharp. "But here's the thing, they never see what's coming." James smiled slightly. "I guess they don't." Harrington leaned back, smirking. "Let's make sure they never forget this lesson." And with that, James knew this night was only the beginning. As he walked out of the restaurant with Lily by his side, he could feel the weight of the evening settling in. The way they had been treated, the humiliation, the sudden reversal, it all lingered in his mind. But what stayed with him the most was Harrington's words. There was something deeper behind them, something more than just a rich man standing up for a mechanic he happened to know. James had a feeling this wasn't the last time he'd be hearing from Mr. Harrington. A week passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. James spent his days at the auto shop, his hands deep in engines, his mind occupied with the familiar hum of machinery. He had almost convinced himself that the dinner was just a strange, fleeting moment, until the call came. It was early morning, the shop had just opened, and James was wiping his hands clean when his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. James Carter. The voice on the other end was cool, composed. "Speaking," James replied cautiously. "This is Mr. Harrington's office. He would like to see you today at noon. His driver will be at your shop in an hour." James blinked. What for?" There was a pause. "Mr. Harrington will explain himself. Please be ready." The line went dead. James stared at his phone, then at the grease on his hands. Lily had been right. Something about that dinner had set things in motion, and now he was about to find out exactly what. An hour later, a sleek black car pulled up outside the shop. The driver, dressed in an immaculate suit, stepped out and opened the door. James hesitated before climbing in, feeling out of place against the smooth leather seats and polished wood paneling. The drive was silent, the city passing by in a blur, until they arrived in front of a towering glass skyscraper, Harrington Enterprises. The moment he stepped inside, the air changed. The lobby was massive, the kind of place where the walls were lined with abstract art that probably cost more than his entire auto shop. A receptionist greeted him with a polite nod before leading him to an elevator. It shot up so fast that his ears popped. The doors opened to a sprawling office with a view of the entire city. Mr. Harrington stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. When he turned, there was that same calculating smirk on his face. "James," he said, motioning for him to sit. "I appreciate you coming." James sat cautiously. "Can't say I had much of a choice." Harrington chuckled. "I suppose not." He poured himself a drink, but didn't offer James one. "I have a proposition for you." James leaned forward. "I figured." "What is it?" Harrington sipped his drink, then set it down. "I've been in this city long enough to know the difference between men who wait for opportunities and men who create them." He looked James directly in the eye. "I believe you're the latter." James frowned. "You got all that from a dinner?" Harrington chuckled again. "No, I got that from the way you carried yourself after they tried to throw you out. Most men would have shouted, made a scene, begged for a table. You didn't. You held your ground. That tells me you're a man who understands power." James exhaled slowly. "And what exactly do you need from a mechanic?" Harrington's smirk deepened. "I need someone who knows how to fix more than just cars." There was something in his tone, something layered beneath the words, and James caught it immediately. This wasn't just about an engine or a broken-down vehicle. This was bigger. "I'm listening," James said carefully. Harrington leaned forward. "There's a man in this city, Robert Langley. He owns half the high-end restaurants, real estate, and businesses. He's a shark, the kind that doesn't leave anything alive in his path. And I want him gone. James's heart pounded. Gone. Harrington's eyes gleamed. Not in the way you're thinking. I mean ruined. Broken. Brought to his knees. James exhaled. And what does this have to do with me? Harrington picked up a file from his desk and slid it across. Because Robert Langley owns that restaurant that threw you out. And if I'm right, that wasn't the first time he's treated people like they're nothing. James's fingers tightened around the file. He hadn't thought much about the restaurant's owner that night, but now, with everything coming together, it made sense. So, you want me to what? Spy on him? Dig up dirt? Harrington leaned back, amused. You're smarter than you look. But no, not exactly. I want you to take something from him. Something that matters more than money. His reputation. James opened the file and scanned the contents. There were pictures, documents, transactions that looked off. Illegal even. If this was real, Langley was running more than just restaurants. James exhaled. You sure about this? Harrington's smirk never wavered. I never make a move unless I'm sure. James stared at the file, then at Harrington. He thought about that night, about the way he was looked at like he was worthless. He thought about all the people like him working hard, only to be treated as if they didn't belong. He closed the file. When do we start? Harrington grinned. That's the spirit. As James walked out of that skyscraper, file in hand, he knew one thing for certain. He had just stepped into a world far bigger than cars and grease-stained hands. And there was no turning back now. The city stretched before him, bustling and indifferent. But James felt different. The weight of the file in his hand was heavier than it looked. It wasn't just paper. It was a weapon. A loaded gun with Langley's name written all over it. But even as he stepped onto the sidewalk, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Why him? Why did Harrington choose a mechanic for this? He needed answers, but first he needed time to think. He headed back to the shop, tossing a file onto his workbench as he walked in. The scent of oil and metal filled the air, grounding him. This was where he belonged. Not in skyscrapers, not in suits, not in games played by men with too much power. Lily walked in, wiping her hands on a rag. She raised an eyebrow. You look like you just saw a ghost. James hesitated, then nodded at the file. Might be worse than that. Lily picked it up and flipped through the pages. Her expression darkened as she skimmed over the documents. This is serious. Yeah, James muttered. Harrington wants me to help take Langley down. Lily slammed the file shut. And you're actually considering it? James ran a hand through his hair. I don't know, but I can't just ignore it. You were there that night, Lily. You saw how they treated us. People like Langley. He doesn't just step on people like me. He grinds them into the dirt. Lily crossed her arms. And what do you think happens when you start messing with people like that? You think he's just going to roll over? James exhaled sharply. I don't know. But Harrington seems sure about this. And I need to know why he picked me. Lily sighed, shaking her head. This isn't like fixing an engine, James. You can't just tighten a bolt and hope it holds. If you do this, you're stepping into something you can't just walk away from. James knew she was right. But that night at the restaurant still burned in his mind. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had already stepped in. For the next few days, James studied the file. Every page was a window into Langley's empire. His restaurants were just the surface. Underneath, there were real estate deals that didn't add up, offshore accounts, bribed officials. Langley wasn't just powerful. He was untouchable. The kind of man who bought his way out of problems before they even started. Then there were the personal details. His routine, his connections, the names of people who owed him favors. The deeper James looked, the clearer it became. Langley wasn't just a businessman. He was a king. And Harrington wanted James to help topple him. Then something caught his eye. A name buried deep in the records. Peter Calloway. James frowned, flipping through the pages. The name appeared multiple times in Langley's transactions, always linked to high-value properties. But something was off. The addresses didn't match. The amounts fluctuated wildly. It looked like Calloway was a front for something. But what? James leaned back, staring at the name. He had no idea who Peter Calloway was, but he had a feeling he was about to find out. That night, he made his first move. He drove to one of the listed properties, a high-end club on the east side of town. The kind of place where men like Langley did their real business. James wasn't stupid. He wasn't going in blind. He stayed in his truck, watching from across the street. Hours passed. Men in suits came and went. Expensive cars pulled up, dropping off people who looked like they ran the city. But then, just past midnight, James saw something that made his blood run cold. Langley stepped out of the club, and right behind him was Harrington. James gripped the steering wheel. They weren't enemies. They were working together. His mind raced. Had Harrington set him up? Was this some kind of test? Or worse, was he just a pawn in something bigger? He knew one thing for sure. He needed answers. And he needed them now. The next morning, James didn't wait for a call. He went straight to Harrington's office, barging past the receptionist before she could stop him. The doors to Harrington's office swung open, and Harrington looked up from his desk, mildly amused. "James," he said, "I wasn't expecting you." James threw the file onto the desk. "Cut the crap. I saw you with Langley last night." Harrington leaned back, unfazed. "And?" James narrowed his eyes. "And that means you're lying to me. You want to take him down, but you're standing right beside him." Harrington smirked. "James, let me ask you something. Do you think men like Langley survive without knowing exactly who's coming for them?" James clenched his fists. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Harrington said slowly, "that if I wasn't in that room, Langley would already know someone was digging into him. And that would make this a lot harder." James hesitated. The logic made sense, but something still felt off. "So what? You're playing both sides." Harrington stood up, walking to the window. "I'm playing to win. Langley doesn't just fall because someone pushes him. He falls because he never sees the push coming." He turned back to James, his gaze sharp. "But if you're having second thoughts, now is the time to walk away." James exhaled. "You knew I wouldn't." Harrington smiled. "That's why I chose you." James left the office with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Harrington was playing a dangerous game, and James was right in the middle of it. For the next week, James watched, waited, and listened. He followed Langley's movements, piecing together his routine. He visited the properties under Calloway's name, searching for a pattern. And finally he found it. One of the properties, a high-rise downtown, wasn't just another investment. It was a shell company, a front for something bigger, something Langley didn't want anyone to know about. James knew he had to act fast. He sent the information to Harrington, expecting him to make a move. But that night, as James closed up the shop, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was cold. "You should have stayed in your lane, mechanic." The line went dead. James turned, and before he could react, the world went black. When he came to, he was in a dark room. His hands were tied, the taste of blood in his mouth. A single light flickered above, and across from him, a man sat in a chair, watching. "Langley." He smiled, slow and deliberate. "You've been busy, haven't you?" James swallowed, his mind racing. Langley leaned forward. "You think I don't know when someone's digging into my business?" He shook his head. "I don't know what Harrington told you, but here's the truth. He's not your friend. He never was." James stayed silent, his heart pounding. Langley chuckled. "You're not the first guy he's used to do his dirty work. But let me tell you how this ends." He stood up, stepping closer. "You disappear, and no one asks questions." James knew he had one shot. He forced a smirk, despite the pain. "If that were true, I'd be dead already." Langley's smile faltered. James exhaled. "Harrington wanted you to find me, didn't he?" He shook his head. "This isn't about me. This is about you too. And I'm just the bait." Langley's expression darkened. James had hit a nerve. And just like that, the door behind Langley burst open. The game had just changed.